Hello, everyone. I'm Steve Miska, Executive Director of First Amendment Voice. Are you concerned about the state of civil discourse in our country, or maybe even in your own community? If you want to help FAV bring programming like the discussion you're getting ready to watch to others, please consider going to our website at firstamendmentvoice.org and click on the Join tab. You can learn about the benefits of membership and become a part of a movement reinvigorating and understanding about freedoms of speech, religion, the press, assembly, and petition. And if you like our videos, feel free to subscribe to our YouTube channel. That's First Amendment Voice, all one word, .org, O-R-G. Thank you, and enjoy the webinar. Let's go ahead and welcome everybody to our first panel discussion of the 2020 Symposium. This is the first time we've done it in a virtual format. Usually we meet in person at a place like the National Constitution Center in Philadelphia or in Washington, D.C., and convene our speakers there. Obviously, that's not feasible in 2020 with the pandemic currently going on. One thing I would ask is you can rotate if you go to your view on Zoom. You can switch if you'd like to be in speaker mode or gallery mode. Speaker mode allows you to see the current speaker on your screen, and then gallery mode will let you see all of our panelists and moderator on the screen. This year's theme for the whole symposium, we wanted to look at how the pandemic has impacted the First Amendment across all of the First Amendment freedoms. So freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom to assemble and petition the government for grievance. And so we've got a series of panels looking at that. And our first panel today is focused on free expression. And so I'm just really grateful to our audience members who are showing up, but also our speakers and our moderator. Thank you. And I would like to say that our volunteers are enabling us to do this and allow the speakers to focus on the substance of the conversation. So we really are grateful to our volunteers for stepping up and supporting that. We've got a lot of other programming going on throughout the rest of the week. There's still some difficult conversations, workshop slots available for Wednesday and Thursday. This morning's session is actually still going on and was sold out. So if you'd like to join, I think after hearing this conversation today, you might decide maybe that's a good next step in terms of where we are with free expression. You know, maybe I'll attend that workshop and explore how to have difficult conversations. I'm not gonna go much longer. I just would like to say the reason we do it this time of year, the reason we celebrate at this time of year is because of September 17th, which is Constitution Day and Citizenship Day. And so 233 years ago on September 17th, the Constitution was signed. We celebrate that as a way to explore citizenship and what it means for us to be engaged and active as citizens and participate in our republic. So that's the whole reason for being here. And we've got this wonderful panel. And so I'm going to turn it over to Larry Rosenberg, our moderator. He is a First Amendment Voice board member, a rock star partner at Jones Day who has litigated First Amendment issues all the way to the Supreme Court. So Larry, please take it away.
Steve, thanks very much. I just want to note for the audience, apparently I've been told that it appears that I may have a halo on top or behind me because of the strange lighting in my home office here. I want to assure you that I am actually on the planet Earth, that the halo effect, though is something I want to cultivate, is just an appearance. But encourage you that if you're into halos, we have a wonderful freedom of religion panel later in the week. So with that out of the way, as Steve said, I'm a litigator. I do litigate constitutional and First Amendment issues. I feel very passionately about free expression and its importance in our society. And with that, we have a wonderful panel assembled today to talk through free expression, how it's been affected by the pandemic, and a number of issues that have come up. And I think the most effective way for the panelists to be introduced is for them to introduce themselves. So in alphabetical order, maybe we could start with Nora.
Hi, Larry. Before we get started with the introductions, I have a quick question for clarification.
Yeah, sure.
Do you want the attendees to know that the questions will be answered at the end or as they come in?
Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, we will, so keep putting your questions in. If there's an opportunity to get them answered during the discussion, we may do that. But primarily, we're going to have probably 15 or 20 minutes at the end to answer questions. So we're not going to necessarily stop the flow with questions, but I'll see the questions as they come in, and if we can work them in, we may try to do that. But thank you. Nora.
Thanks, Larry, and I'm really thrilled to be here. It's a surreal world we live in now that everything is virtual, but I feel like it's a wonderful opportunity to sometimes actually reach even more people. My name is Nora Benavidez. I work at PEN America, where I am the director of our US Free Expression programs. I'm also a lawyer by training, and prior to coming to PEN, I was really a constitutional litigator and focused quite a bit on First Amendment litigation, representing journalists, protesters, any number of people around government transparency, press freedom, freedom of assembly, and other First Amendment issues. At PEN America, I run our US advocacy and policy work, and that focuses on protecting press freedom, protecting protest rights, working on digital threats to free expression, including disinformation, which I'll speak a little bit about today as well, and everything in between. And so it's great to be here. For time, I will end there.
Okay, Doyle, if you could introduce yourself, please.
Sure. My name is Doyle Hodges. I'm the executive editor of Texas National Security Review. Really humbled to be on this panel because unlike our distinguished moderator or my other two panelists, I lack a professional background in free expression or unique knowledge that's relevant to the pandemic. My background, I was a naval officer for 21 years. After retirement, I went into academia, and now, as I mentioned, I'm editing a journal focused on national security broadly defined. But I do think that my background gives me a lens through which to view these issues, because these are, in fact, the issues that motivated me, at least in part, for my service. And they are issues that are absolutely central to discussion of security in a way that I think we've all learned during the pandemic is much broader than our previous conceptions of security that focused principally on hard power or military competition may actually have encompassed.
And then finally, Deborah Topol, before she introduces herself, I have a disclaimer. Dr. Topol and I are married. And if you are wondering, yes, she does insist that at home I call her Dr. Topol.
Okay. Hi, everybody. I am Deborah Topol. I am an internal medicine physician in Washington, D.C. at MedStar Washington Hospital Center. I'm also Associate Dean for Medical Education at Georgetown Medical School. I went to University of Pennsylvania, where I majored in the biological basis of behavior. I did residency and chief residency at Georgetown before I came to my job here at Washington Hospital Center, where my focus is on teaching medical students and teaching internal medicine residents as well.
Okay. Well, thank you all for introducing yourselves. And now, before we get into sort of our moderated format, each of the panelists has prepared some short opening remarks about some of the key issues they want to communicate. And so I think now is a great time for that. Nora, if you could lead us off there.
Sure. Well, you know, I think if we're talking about COVID-19 and what has happened to free expression since, let's say, March here in the US and around the world, you know, I want to take us back to what that felt like, because I don't know about you, but things have rapidly progressed and evolved. But there was absolutely, I think, a sense of confusion, chaos, And the public really kind of didn't know where to turn, I remember. And part of what we do at PEN America is we try to work with media partners as well as with our constituents to give them and point them to credible information. And part of what we were seeing in March was just this hunger for information, for health news, which I know Deborah will talk a little bit about, and access. And, you know, what we were finding was that over the weeks throughout the end of March and into April, we were seeing a few really disturbing things. And so we went into high gear. I'm going to share, just so people see, some of what we started putting together, which was mapping out the threats to free expression that we were seeing globally. And part of that was really focused on 4 core areas. One is we were deeply concerned at PEN America that we were seeing encroachments on and violations of press freedom, in which journalists were unable to attend briefings by leaders here in the US and elsewhere, even down to the very local level around the United States. We were also seeing issues around truth, and that disinformation was really rampant. I think we all know about the infodemic that the World Health Organization claimed was blowing up in January. And then we also saw limits to access to information. And there are examples that I think would abound. You know, the FBI announced in March that it would begin limiting its responses to federal information, you know, FOIA requests. There were other incidents in which at the state and local level, government agencies were saying they simply didn't have the bandwidth anymore to answer requests for information. This sort of compounded then by the lack of reporting, the limits to funding for journalists, and even the targeting of dissidents and sort of the slow chipping away of civil liberties, we were very worried about. And so what we have done over the last many months now since March is trying to elevate that free expression is under threat, and in a unique way. That so much of what we are seeing where these threats occur seem to almost be under what we call cover of coronavirus. That while people were in March and April worried and concerned and not knowing where to turn, there were all of these steps that felt somehow like a distancing from our democratic and constitutional ideals here in the United States. And that, my concern, the concern of my colleagues, has continued over the last several months. And so part of what we do now is, in the through line of our work, is we always defend press freedom where it is threatened. And we have become more and more concerned about issues involving freedom of assembly. And that we've seen legislative attacks and other kinds of attacks against those that are trying to exercise their freedom of assembly rights. And so that is then compounded by what we've seen where journalists are attacked while trying to cover protests. Just this weekend, a new incident occurred in which a reporter in Los Angeles from NPR tried to cover protests happening in Los Angeles and was attacked by police. While she was attacked, you know, you can hear her. She has her press badge hanging with from a lanyard. It's very visible in photographs and in video of her. And she says, you know, you're hurting me. I'm a journalist. I am here. Here are my credentials. This is now upwards of the 500th incident in which journalists have been attacked only during the protests. And the attacks on press freedom we have seen rise, so much so that just today, UNESCO put out a report saying that the level of violations and press freedom violations have reached a fever pitch around the whole world. And so under cover of Corona feels like this sort of blanket where we've been able to explore what happens when people are not able to access information, when they are perhaps distracted, and how might, when we're not looking and when general, the general public is occupied and otherwise consumed, what happens to our civil liberties? What happens to our First Amendment rights and to our free expression principles in this country? And so our job is to defend where those rights are and for the people that have them. And so we've been doing that through putting together advocacy with governors, trying to hold them accountable to investigate attacks on journalists. We've been working with legislators at the state level to identify where anti-protest legislation violates the First Amendment. And then the final piece is that we are working on trying to empower online users to understand how they can sift through credible information and identify disinformation. So that's sort of the 30,000 foot view of what we've been up to. And, you know, I'm so happy over the next hour or so to dive in more deeply to some of the areas that we're working on and some of our impact and successes.
Thank you, Nora. Doyle, if you want to give some opening remarks.
Sure. I really like the framing that Nora just used of under the cover of COVID, because it not only highlights, I think, some of the really unique and challenging conditions that are right now, but it also points out that these are things that were occurring before COVID. And that while COVID may have changed the context, it may not have changed some of the fundamental underlying challenges and behaviors. And so I think if we're going to talk about free expression in a pandemic, and that we need to also contextualize it in the time that the pandemic is occurring. We are in one of the most polarized and divisive times in recent memory in our country's past. We're approaching a highly fraught election. There is evidence that foreign governments are taking advantage of pre-existing divisions within our society and trying to stoke those things in order to influence the outcome of the election, as well as just to generally create more unrest. And so we find ourselves at a time when, even without the extraordinary challenges of a pandemic, we would have some pretty unique and difficult considerations associated with freedom of expression. But the pandemic affects how we talk, it affects who we talk to, and it affects what we talk about. And one of the ways in which it affects how we talk is that so much of the expression that so many of us consume and engage in on a daily basis is occurring on social media. And social media has a number of attributes that tend to make expression on it more extreme, more prone to challenging characterizations. For starters, we are able to select our own inputs and audience, and so it becomes something of an echo chamber. It also, because people are not seeing each other face to face and at times are operating under the cover of a pseudonym, increases distance and tends to enhance the ability to dehumanize the person with whom you're talking. And because you engage in discussion about things that are well beyond your personal experience, the temptation to engage in collectivization and collective characterizations of those who have views which may not be your own is quite high. And none of these are actually conducive to thoughtful discussion. They're all protected by free expression, but they aren't necessarily the way in which a democratic society is going to move forward and resolve challenging issues in the spirit of comedy. In terms of who we're talking to, as I mentioned, we select who our audience is on social media. And so increasingly, we speak to those whose views are congenial to our own, and we find reason not to engage with those who are not. And in terms of what we talk about, we're confronted with a novel challenge, something that science and medicine have not seen before in this particular virus. Certainly we've seen pandemics before, but the particulars of it are unique. And everyone wants knowledge. Everyone wants some idea that there's going to be a way out, a plan, or something else. But it's a particularly ripe time for people to replace scientific knowledge with fear, to engage in discrediting of scientific or other things that disagree with their particular points of view. And it just absolutely, these things together actually put into challenge the whole notion of whether or not we have as a society an objectively agreed truth. When Nora spoke of the incident with the reporter in LA, I've seen in my social media feed people engaging with the video, with the pictures, saying, no, she didn't announce that she was press. How on earth do you find a commonly agreed truth when people look at the same thing, come to wildly different conclusions? So I think those are some of the particular challenges that we face. They weren't challenges that were created by COVID, but they're certainly challenges that are amplified during this period.
Thanks, Doyle. If I may, for just a second before I introduce Dr. Topol again, you know, there's a concept in the law that for decades was kind of paramount in First Amendment thought, which was the marketplace of ideas. You may have heard of that. And there was a theory, and it ran through a great number of Supreme Court cases, that speech was always good, that more speech was better, that if somebody says something that you don't like, you respond with more speech. that if there's a problem, having everybody state his or her viewpoint is the right way to go. But then in the 1970s, there began a little bit of pushback on that called market failure theory, which is that some people, if they control the speech, if they have outsized influence, if they have expertise, if they're political leaders, if they control media networks, those people can frame the conversation, perhaps shift the conversation in ways that are correct. And so, for example, there were some famous cases about equal time for candidates on the other side in presentations and ads and debates, things like that. We live in a very difficult time where we do have this issue that some people have voices that are quite frankly louder and more prominent than others. And when those people say things that are scientifically false, or they say things that try to stir division, they can be particularly impactful. And so there's a real question about, particularly in a time that really emergency, how well does the marketplace of ideas function? And are there special obligations that certain speakers should have to say things that are true, to say things that, if they're based allegedly on science, actually represent science accurately? And I think there are people who have different viewpoints even on that fundamental question. But Dr. Topol, maybe you could give us some of your introductory remarks.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've all lived for a long time. Never in my life have I seen a time where the things that we do so immediately impact those around us. These things we did just a year ago, going to the supermarket, singing, can now directly hurt those around us. And it's a very bizarre time where these things we do have such fundamental, profound impact on others. It affects others, the air we breathe, where we go out, who we see, and how people are choosing to deal with this is fascinating to see. This title is, speaking through a mask. It is an absolute fact that COVID-19 is a respiratory illness. It is transmitted through the respiratory system. This should not be a thing that you shouldn't wear a mask. Like, it protects people. You wear it, you will help fundamentally protect all of those around you from getting sick or dying. That is a fact. And the ramifications are huge. So people may think, okay, well, I'm healthy, so I can do what I want. I'm not going to get COVID. But if you end up in the hospital for something else, you have a car accident, you burst your appendix, these hospitals have visiting policies. You will be alone. Even if you're not in the hospital for COVID, you're not going to be able to have your family around you. It's strict, these visitor policies, to just kind of protect us and to protect the, the whole community at large. So it's a little, I think sometimes there's a little short-sightedness in people being very much into the, well, I'll be fine, so it's up to you, and isolate yourself if you're worried. There is a collective responsibility here to behave responsibly and to listen carefully to those telling us when they know more than we do. Now that becomes tricky as well, because then what we are relying on is our experts, our scientists, to tell us the truth, to give us the facts, and to not filter them, not water them down, not change them for this reason or that reason. Just, here is what the facts are of the illness. Here's what we know so far, and here's what we need to do to protect ourselves. Now, what's also very challenging about this whole fact thing is that this is a brand new illness. And because this was so brand new, at the beginning, there was so much that we just didn't know that we know now. So all of this, oh, well, at the beginning, they didn't say to wear a mask, so this is stupid. They didn't know. Like, this was brand new. We didn't have the evidence. We didn't have the literature. So it's everyone's responsibility. We need to listen. We need to read. We need to see what's available. We need to, trust people to advise us appropriately. And the scientists need to be accurate, be truthful in their reporting, and work for the collective good. But some things that are happening for the collective good here may be quite different than what people want to do for their own personal good. And that's where a lot of the difficulties lie.
Okay, thank you very much. I think those are all very interesting introductory thoughts. I think I want to shift a little bit into a few of the specific issues that have arisen in this area. And there are a whole lot of them, and we could cover, 30 issues if we had the time, but we're going to try to distill it to 4 or 5 key issues. And then we'll either work some of the questions, we've already gotten several questions, and we'll either work them into our discussion or handle them at the end. But the first topic I'd like to raise, and we'll start with Nora, though, we've already heard a lot of these thoughts in the introductory remarks, but maybe if you could just try to isolate, what are the most specific and serious challenges to free expression and assembly during the pandemic that you've seen?
Oh, Larry, trick question. That's a lot. And, I think, so part of what we've done is we've analyzed the state of protest rights and freedom of assembly here in the US over the last several months. And I think one of the most dire issues is that we have a lopsided protection for different voices speaking regarding the First Amendment. I have been troubled to see from our own research how when certain voices in certain communities try to engage in public, free expression, such as protesting, demonstrating, there are different ways that law enforcement and government officials treat those different types of protest movements. And I, as a sort of, long-standing ambassador for the First Amendment, have been really troubled by a few things. One is the rhetoric coming from our president regarding the First Amendment. And that I think that there is a kind of politicization of First Amendment rights, where some, if our president likes the speech or the views of those protesting, he applauds them. And when he does not, he calls them anything from thugs to criminals to other words that are denigrating and incredibly offensive. And I find that that type of tone has trickled down over the years now since 2016 to state legislators. And so what we've seen are some, I would say, layers of threats to free expression in the freedom of assembly realm. One is absolutely, there has been a rise in anti-protest legislation since 2017. In 2015 and 2016, legislators around the country, in the wake of protest movements like BLM, Black Lives Matter, even protests led by Native American protesters, for example, challenging things like the Dakota Pipeline project and construction, they were not met with any kind of legislative crackdown. And then after Donald Trump was elected, we saw a rise in which almost 60 protest and anti-protest bills were introduced in 2017, which frankly, I didn't think we would find, when I started doing research on what was the state of free expression. And sure enough, there is this very clear corollary where legislators have been emboldened to attack tactics when certain protesters use them. That really targets, and the bills that we have seen over the last several years have attacked Black Lives Matter and those challenging Dakota Pipeline projects. Ironically, there have also been attacks on people who are wearing masks, and an effort over the last several years to criminalize mask wearing, which we found ironic given that in a report that was released this May, the question of mask wearing was sort of reinvigorated in a completely different context. And legislators began grappling with, well, what are the political and public health implications of something like us criminalizing people who wear masks? But in practice now, what I have seen is no dampening of these efforts, both at the legislative and I would say at just sort of a leadership level, where when certain protests happen now, leaders are incredibly emboldened to be able to talk through that they want to silence certain speech. And I feel like that is leaning, if not very aggressively veering into a lopsided First Amendment. If we are in this country choosing whose speech and whose opinions we like, and then allowing, supporting, encouraging, applauding that speech. And at the same time, in the same breath, denigrating and criminalizing speech on the part of others, that sets us up to, I think, in the years to come, see more and more efforts by law enforcement and government officials to feel like they can do that. And I worry that between our courts being completely, clearly an inadequate avenue right now to deal with these bills that often linger and are not challenged, I also think our legislative and sort of state legislative branch is not adequate right now in figuring out how they can combat these types of problematic bills that become law. And we have leaders at every level, from the local all the way up to the federal, that are interested in setting a tone that really kind of delineates what speech is allowable and then what speech is somehow considered criminal or inherently criminal. And that notion right there, that somehow the narrative being cast is that some speech is okay and other speech is not okay, is one that I have seen amplified and given so much oxygen since COVID and sort of since the work from home and other, guidelines here in the US. So I would just sort of say that that narrative being cast, to me, is incredibly troubling. And I'll stop there for now.
Yeah, so Nora, I think you sort of explained this from kind of a government perspective and a legislative perspective. Doyle, maybe you could comment a little bit on what are the challenges we've seen to free expression, not based on sort of official action, but the way we're talking to each other every day, non-government, normal people talking to each other every day.
Yeah, this, and it actually, I think, gets in as well to questions of disinformation. But one of the particular challenges of the fora in which we're talking is that they are privately owned, privately hosted for purposes of making a profit. And so it's fascinating the degree to which you hear cries, for example, of censorship when someone seeks to make a statement and the organization that is the host for that seeks to quiet it. Well, when we're operating in this private setting, the First Amendment does not prevent a private party from telling you what type of conversation they're interested in having occur on their platform. And then that raises a question. When a platform is so ubiquitous as these social media platforms are, do they have a special responsibility? Do they fulfill some sort of different role other than just as a salon where people can go have a conversation that they would have somewhere else, and where the host of the salon can choose what type of conversation is or isn't acceptable? And then also, it's interesting, again, when Nora was raising the question of types of speech that are being considered to be presumptively criminal or unlawful. There's this really uncomfortable interaction here because we have, on the one hand, laws against hate speech that have come up really principally in the last 20 to 30 years, maybe a little bit earlier than that, and the lawyers of the panel can correct my history there. But so those are well-intended, they serve a good purpose. At the same time, once you start regulating speech for its content, you run into a whole host of issues about what type of content crosses particular lines. And now when I move into a private rather than a governmental setting, I get an even greater challenge as to what the role of the host is when they characterize speech in a particular way, whether that's through flagging speech on Facebook, telling a group that they cannot have their Facebook page, doing these other sorts of things. And so this all comes together in questions that are legitimately questions of free expression, but that implicate a whole different set of issues than traditional governmental restraint of speech. And oftentimes the actual controlling issues are not the First Amendment, but questions of liability for libel or slander or things like this. And there you get into, again, the challenge of our challenged conception of reality, because so often those things revolve around whether or not the statement was true, or whether the person making the statement should have known that it was true or acted with a reckless disregard for truth. And how do you even begin to characterize that when we live in an environment where people providing radio talk shows for a combination of news and entertainment are promoting outlandish conspiracy theories with accusations against public figures, and when confronted with it, say, well, this was for entertainment. This was not intended to be a representation of truth. So I don't have a lot of answers. I could just tell you that it's some really sticky and difficult questions, and that the conditions of it make it unlikely that it's going to resolve in a positive way anytime soon.
Yeah. Deborah, maybe you could share with us a little bit as a physician, your feeling not on legal restrictions, but ethical restrictions that you have on the you engage in as a physician.
Ethical restrictions on what in particular?
On how you speak, on whether you have to represent things in a certain way or what you would say about, for example, the pandemic.
Right. I mean, you have to really think about what you're saying and how you're saying it, because whatever you say and however you role model and whatever you behave, people can directly get sick as a result of what you're doing. And, you know, we see that a lot. So both in how we advise our patients, and, you know, there's a lot of, what about my job? Can I go to work? What can I do this? Can I do that? And, you know, there's also a lot of gray area with some of this stuff too. So we have to be really thoughtful about it. And then we have to think about what we're doing ourselves. We're constantly being told sort of by our hospital epidemiologists who are very concerned about the physician transmission rate. They're like, do not let your guard down. Do not let your guard down in the hospital. We've had groups of certain hospital associates just eating lunch together, and then there've been COVID cases directly among them in the hospital, sitting there eating lunch together. So they're like, you need to think about everything that you're doing. And then there's comments from patients. They're like, well, we saw our doctor and she was doing this, or she wasn't doing that, and that's not acceptable. So really now more than ever, just a lot of thought to how we're saying things, what we're saying, and the behaviors that we're doing each day are just requiring a lot of extra care and consideration.
Would you say that the Hippocratic Oath and other aspects of the ethics of physicians requires you to represent scientific facts accurately?
Absolutely. I mean, you say kind of first, do no harm. So that means that any single thing we're going to say, if you're going to promote something that's not evidence-based, that's harmful. Medications or treatments that have a lot of harms, and we've seen the harms, to promote them, to use them is not ethically acceptable. I think, you know, and I'm sure I will trust the FDA on this, but the whole vaccine thing, we are trusting that when they say a vaccine is acceptable, has been through phase 3, has been looked at and is ready for more widespread administration, we need to trust that that is true. Otherwise, if things are being rushed, if things aren't safe, it's ethically completely unacceptable.
Yeah, so we've got a couple of questions that I want to address briefly now. One question that we got is, do I have a constitutional right to choose not to wear a mask? And Deborah, just from the medical perspective, is there any doubt whatsoever about the efficacy of masks? And maybe you could talk about that Starbucks, I think in Korea example.
Yeah, sure. There's two studies that I really like about the masks. And again, I will say this. This is a respiratory illness. This is transmitted via the respiratory system, period. But there's two things that I like. One was a paper that came out of Korea where they looked at a Starbucks, and somebody in Korea, they were allowed to sit in at this particular Starbucks, and one person who sat there and had her coffee and sat there for 2 hours,
She was
not wearing a mask. She was drinking her coffee.
Right.
Drinking her coffee, sitting there doing work, and they literally had hundreds of people infected with COVID. However, the baristas who were there during that entire afternoon, all of them wearing masks, none of them got COVID. So I thought that was really interesting. The other one that I don't know if you heard about was about the hair cutters, the salon cutters in what was one of the Midwestern states. And so two of the hair cutters, they both had COVID. They should not have been working. They should not have been cutting their clients' hairs, but they were symptomatic. They were wearing masks. Between the two of them, they cut the hair over a week of 90 clients. And of those 90 clients, none of them got COVID, even though both of the hair cutters were like symptomatic with COVID, but they were wearing masks. So the evidence for masks is it will markedly decrease the transmission of COVID. Will it take it to zero? Probably not, but it will markedly decrease it.
So let me just share for a minute, this is in response to that question. And there was also a question that I'll deal with here as well about the Supreme Court decision not staying Nevada's order that churches could not assemble with more than 50 people, but not shutting down the casinos in Nevada. So there's a Supreme Court case, which I don't think has been discussed nearly as much as I would have expected in the media, I believe called Jacobson versus Massachusetts. That is a case from 1905. And the issue in the case was whether Massachusetts could forcibly require people to take a smallpox vaccine. And the state of Massachusetts said, yes, you will get vaccinated. And if you don't, it's a criminal offense. And the Supreme Court said, that's fine. The police powers of the state in the midst of a pandemic, then smallpox, can permit a state to require its citizens to be vaccinated. I know there are a lot of people who don't like vaccinations. Maybe there's some people on this call. That's the law of the land. That is the United States Supreme Court precedent. It has not been overturned. It has not been cut back. So getting to the constitutional rights, a state has the ability through the 10th Amendment, through the powers reserved to the states, its police powers, to issue edicts and decrees to deal with how we interact and what we do publicly and what we do in light of a pandemic. It's black letter law. And so the question in a lot of these cases that have come up is, where does that right end, or how does it interact with things like freedom of religion? And these are admittedly very difficult questions, right? We live in a society, we have a constitution that guarantees freedom of religion, and part of religious practice for the vast majority of religions is in-person interaction. And yet, state after state after state has regulated that because, as a matter of science, we know that if you are in a religious building and you are praying, which means you are speaking, or you are singing, you are transmitting virus if you have virus. I mean, there's no question about that. There's also no question from anecdote after anecdote of people in church choirs and other religious institutions getting sick, that particularly when people are speaking loudly or singing, you transmit more virus. And so the question in all these cases has been this well-established right of the states to regulate behavior during a pandemic. Do you have to create exceptions, or do you have to treat religious institutions or other constitutional rights differently? And what the Supreme Court has said in a series of 5-4 decisions, with Chief Justice Roberts voting with the more liberal justices, is that we're going to, for now, this is what the Supreme Court's saying, we're basically going to just delegate this to the states. And so in California, where California said we're not going to allow more than whatever it was, 50 or 100 people to be in a religious building at the same time until conditions improve, the Supreme Court said, yeah, that's unfortunate, but it's the state's decision to make. They're the ones who have the best handle on how the pandemic is affecting their state. When Nevada decided that they weren't going to allow more than 50 people in a church, but they were going to allow people in casinos, where the casinos had implemented certain social distancing and other requirements. One of the requirements now is, it wasn't necessarily initially, but now in Nevada, you cannot enter a casino without wearing a mask, end of story. You'll be turned away, or at least you should be turned away if you're not wearing a mask. They will provide masks. They have hand sanitizing stations. Many casinos have put up plexiglass to separate people at gaming tables. And so the court made this decision, not in a lengthy decision, but just sort of made this decision on that stay motion, that, you know, maybe they don't agree with it. You know, there are many people who probably personally think that it's a lot more important for there to be religious worship than to be playing blackjack. And I sympathize with that. But what the court was saying is we leave those decisions to the states. And one of the reasons they're leaving the decisions to the states by and large is because of this precedent going back to 1905, that in a pandemic, the states have a significant amount of discretion. Now, interestingly enough, I believe it was today or yesterday, a federal judge in Pennsylvania ruled that the Pennsylvania stay-at-home orders were actually unconstitutional. I haven't read that decision. I just got a note from one of my students about 10 minutes before this call began, and I read a quick article about it. I would be very surprised if that decision survives on appeal, for the very same states have been given a great deal of discretion as to how to handle it. That doesn't mean a state's right doing this. As a matter of policy, maybe they're wrong. Maybe as a matter of religion, ultimately they're doing the wrong thing. But what the US Supreme Court has said, admittedly in a 5-4 decision, all of these have been, I think, 5-4 decisions, is that the states have the ability in the first instance to make these decisions. But all of these have left some room to argue that if you're truly discriminating against religious institutions or discriminating against others where there's constitutional protection, the courts can review it. They're not saying this is unreviewable, but what they're saying is as long as it's not sort of over discrimination, then the courts are permitting that to go forward. So hopefully that answers a couple of those questions. I realize a few more just came in, which I'll look at in a minute. But I want to turn to our next topic, which we've touched on a little bit, which is how social media affects all of this. And Doyle, maybe you could lead off with a little bit of a discussion of how social media has really affected our ability to express ourselves and maybe has posed some increased challenges to expression that we didn't have years ago when we didn't have social media.
Yeah, you know, I think many of the things that I mentioned in response to the earlier question really hold here. It's an environment in which we are distanced from those we speak. We often have the ability to speak pseudonymously to people we don't know, which may diminish our sort of social pressures to behave in ways that we've defined as civil and that give consideration to views other than our own. It is an environment where we've often chosen an audience and our speech can be performative to try to get approval of those who hold views similar to or congenial to our own. And all these things just tend to increase the amplitude of the discussion. It turns up the volume without necessarily adding a lot of good content or thought to it. And it's one of the things I was thinking when you were describing the legal limits on what measures states can take for masks and this other sort of stuff is there's an awful lot that's permissible in this social media environment. But boy, that doesn't make it wise or a good idea. And we have a tendency to say, well, let's push to the boundaries of what's there, or the boundaries are what should define our discussion. And yet there's nothing that compels you to go to a casino in Nevada if you think that it's a dangerous thing to do. In fact, it'd be a pretty good idea not to if you believe it dangerous to do so. So I think social media actually, again, tends to sort of increase that thought that we're going to push to the boundaries of the discussion rather than focusing on what can we do to bring the discussion to the median, to talk about the things that ordinary people living their lives on their ordinary basis are concerned about and interested in and dealing with. And instead we get pulled into the extreme cases, the issues that incite and inflame. And I don't think it does a lot to promote good conversation. It's certainly protected expression, but the degree to which it exacerbates the problem is significant in my view.
Yeah. Deborah, I think there's an example, I'm not sure you want to share it, but one at the hospital with social media recently. I mean, how has social media made life maybe even more challenging for physicians and the kinds of expression they engage in?
Well, I guess it's challenging in a number of ways. We have to be super careful because our hospitals have certain policies about what we are and are not allowed to say on social media. So there's that piece. Then there's the piece of people are posting stuff that absolutely makes no sense. So then we're making the decision, do I engage this? Do I not engage this? Do I engage it just a little bit? And I've decided I'll just lay out just a couple of true facts and then leave it there. Then speaking of facts, would it be okay if I say a couple things, Larry, about just the death rate and the mortality? Because I saw a couple questions on that.
Sure. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Just because I think I saw a couple questions. So the mortality overall with COVID, when it started back in New York in the spring, was as high as 10%. It was insane. And attending who I used to be friends with said they literally had 40 inpatient COVID teams in New York City. It was astounding. It is much better now.
Yeah, 40 teams in one hospital. Yeah.
Yeah, in one hospital in New York, a 600-bed hospital, 40 COVID teams. That was a 10% mortality rate, which is astounding. It is much better now. It's much better now. We have much better treatment. We know better how to care for these patients in the ICU, better things about how to ventilate them, what medications to use. That now the mortality is about 3 to 4%. How does that compare with flu? The flu mortality is about 0.1%. So that's a huge, huge difference, but that neglects a couple things, which is it's not just all about the mortality. There also are people who survive COVID, and then they have long-term morbidity. So looking at death alone is not enough. There are definitely patients who have, and again, it's hard to see right now how far out these problems will go because we're only 6 months out, but prolonged respiratory problems, prolonged neurologic problems, a lot of prolonged disability. So this is not the flu at all in terms of morbidity and mortality. That's definitely something to keep in mind. And then there was the whole thing, and I saw somebody say this about doctors lying to get more funding, and so lying and saying that patients have COVID when they don't. This is another social media thing that kind of popped up. And I read that and I'm like, that's just not how funding works. We get paid for the patients we take care of. Most of us are just paid by our hospitals anyway, as far as hospital-based physicians, which is where the COVID care is happening, is by patient. We're not getting paid more if it's a COVID diagnosis. I was like, that completely neglects the fact that when things were completely insane and uncertain in March and April, it was the doctors who were running in there to just do our job and take care of people. Doctors lost money. Private practices just got killed because people were afraid to go to the doctor. So to say that physicians, that was another social media thing, are getting paid more because they lie and say people have COVID, it just doesn't make sense. So there are a lot of these things that sort of pop up that are completely untrue, and it's hard to correct it. It just,
I mean, I think that also ignores some of the legal ramifications. Like if there's a sense that states may be over-reporting COVID cases that don't exist, I mean, those are felonies. If they misreport the number of cases to the CDC or whatever federal agency is collecting the data, and they're found to have lied about that, they're going to go to jail. I mean, that's, you know, there are tremendous incentives not to do that. I'm not saying that every single report of every single case is 100% accurate. In fact, there have been suspicions that in certain states, Florida being one of them, there was pressure by the governor's office to undercount COVID cases for weeks. And in fact, the person in Florida who was tasked with reporting COVID cases to the federal government resigned because she was concerned that she was being pressured not to give an accurate number. But it's the notion that states or any official count of COVID would be inflated for some funding purpose just flies in the face, as Deborah said, with the real economics in the medical profession, but also laws that strongly protect against that. And given all of the legislative efforts that Nora mentioned to suppress expression because of political purposes, it is extremely hard to believe that if you had governors or state public health officials who are over-reporting COVID, that there wouldn't be lawsuits challenging that, across the country, and it's just not happening. And I think the public health officials, again, some people like them, some people don't, some people believe them, some people don't. We understand there's division in our society about it, but the public health officials have routinely said that if anything, the prevalence of COVID has been vastly underreported, not intentionally necessarily, but simply because there are so many asymptomatic cases. There are people, particularly at the outset of COVID, who were afraid to go to the hospital, who died in their homes, likely tens of thousands in places like New York and other areas, who died in their homes of COVID, but didn't go to the hospital or report it as such because they were afraid or didn't think they had health coverage that would have permitted them to go to the hospital. So yeah, I think that's one of the issues. Nora, oh, Doyle?
I'm sorry, let me just chime in real quick. Deborah made the comment that it's hard to constantly correct these things. And I think it's not only hard, it's exhausting. Imagine if you're walking around and you always have to tell everyone you meet, there's gravity. There's gravity. There's gravity today. There's still gravity. And this is where we are in the social media world, is you're confronted with people saying, no, there's not. And every single day you have to return to first principles, and the ability to advance a conversation past those first principles is just so challenging when you're confronted with this deluge. And not all of it's accidental. There is evidence that there are other governments that are intentionally increasing the volume of this because it causes people to withdraw and to become cynical about the process and to be less likely to be engaged in the political process. But yeah, it's just stinking exhausting.
And you feel like, you know, if you correct them anyway, they're not going to listen and they're still going to come away thinking what they think. So you try, but you feel like you're not really convincing anyone.
Yeah.
Well, and I'm happy to jump in here, Larry.
Yeah.
You know, I think that part of what we were seeing in these early days, because I want to go back, there was that feeling of uncertainty. Like all of us, you know, didn't know, you know, could I go to the grocery store? Could I safely, I live in New York City, so I would say, you know, what's transmission if someone coughs? There were just questions where you didn't know in early March. And so I think that there was this moment people turned to journalism like they truly had never before. It is not a sexy topic to talk about journalists, press freedom. It feels abstract usually to people. And suddenly people were saying, oh, I need to know literally what I can do in my community. And so they were turning to local reporters. And part of what happens in the space when you do not do that is people turn to, and I think are more susceptible to, misleading information. And sometimes it isn't even our fault. Sometimes what we've seen is that people will share what is perhaps disinformation in ways where they actually think they're doing a civic duty. You know, especially those early days in March and April. I remember people were sharing, even on my own feed on Facebook and Twitter, ranging from punditry that was borderline dangerous, you know, and frankly, a lot of those people didn't have the qualifications, like as if I were weighing in on public health and safety measures, which I should not be doing. I'm not a medical professional. I can weigh in on the legal and civil liberties implications and thinking about how we approach a nuanced way of government regulation, because I think we needed that, and we needed to bestow a sense of trust in leaders. Part of what we saw, though, is that there was very little transparency. And even now, Larry, when you mentioned that, you know, the reporting aspects of COVID can lead to felony charges, we've seen troubling examples where in states like Florida, when reporters ask for data, they are thrown out of press briefings. And so the question becomes, what is the truth? Like, really, what's the data here? And part of what we've found is really just that there is this space where people become more susceptible to misleading content when they don't know where else to turn. And so we started putting together a series of resources. In addition to all of the legal and policy work I do, I also run our disinformation defense program at PEN America. And some of that is really geared towards the election. And I have to say the integrity and inception of a program like that was intended to educate people about how to distinguish misleading information from credible news and how to verify images and videos. If you recall, there was that image, that video that was really proliferating of shopping frenzies in March, and people were really worried about food infrastructure breaking down. And I mean, it was crazy. Everyone I knew said, what should I do, Nora? Should I go get, you know, bulk toilet paper, water, everything. And it finally was confirmed that this video was taken from 2013 in Germany. And so it was completely taken out of context, but it led all of these people, thousands and thousands of people, to feel a certain thing. And so part of what we try to help people do now is, one, understand that we're online more than ever, and that the social media aspects really put each of us in a content creator role. And I always think if we empower people to understand, hey, you could be the difference between someone taking as gospel that wearing a mask will somehow activate coronavirus in your mouth, which is not correct. And you could then be potentially the other form of a resource, and a proactive resource on really credible ways to think about what we see online. We're just not taught any of that right now. It's not in our curriculum. It is not, when we're young, you know, we're not building up our digital intelligence, which is called DQ. And certainly adults and older adults are not taught these types of things. And so a lot of our work right now is trying to figure out, how do we best equip people to really empower them to understand what their digital experience is, and how to recognize fake, misleading information so they don't fall prey to it. So we've put together, you know, a number of resources. I shared one earlier in the chat, and I know that Steve has been pushing it a lot on how to talk with friends and family that share misinformation. We also put together a guide on COVID-related disinformation, and I will share that here. That was really just because we saw this frenzy, and I would call it that. It was almost like a hysteria of anyone weighing in about anything, and people just accepting what they saw very passively. And unfortunately, where free expression is concerned, I myself wrestle with the tensions between absolutely wanting to promote an online experience where we are all there and all can engage in discourse, and yet there are growing examples of violence, that online rhetoric leads to real world violence, that it can also lead to harassment and hateful language directed towards journalists, women, people of color. I mean, there are a number of ways that the online realm now has sort of just grown into this very knotted, thorny issue when you think about free expression. And how do we balance allowing people and even promoting discourse, which we should, with then the underbelly of knowing that there are incredibly bad actors. And then there are maybe just Doyle sharing something thinking he's helping and not realizing it's misinformation when he shares it. I don't think Doyle would fall prey. So Doyle, I only use you as an example, but you know, it's that kind of thing that there's this very wide spectrum of how we think about it. And legally, as we know, the platforms are pretty insulated from any kind of liability for what happens online because of Section 230, which we don't have to get into too much. But that's a lot of what we've been up to. I will share one other resource for you because these are honestly very useful. They're very grounded in nonpartisan media literacy skills, which is also how to verify images and videos. Because around the George Floyd protests, we also saw a convergence of protest issues and disinformation. And so in the lead up to the election, in trying to guarantee and protect people's First Amendment rights to vote, we want to also make sure that they understand where they could actually be potentially victims of voter depression efforts and other campaigns from bad actors, foreign and domestic.
Yeah. So I just want to add a quick comment. You talked about the frenzy at the beginning of the pandemic and with lockdowns and people going out to buy, you know, tons of toilet paper and things like that. I will just share that, at least in California where my brother lives, fortunately or unfortunately, the Costco's in the region had a huge sale on toilet paper right before things got really bad. And so I asked my brother at the beginning of that, you know, what's going on with toilet paper? And he said, well, actually, 3 weeks ago, I was at Costco, 200 rolls of toilet paper. So if you're wondering where it all went, that's where. Deborah, let me ask you this question, which is, obviously we've been talking about, you know, the obligation of physicians to say things that are factually based, scientifically based. How does it affect physicians and the healthcare community when they see, for example, people in positions of influence, politicians, whatever, who don't adhere to the Hippocratic Oath, telling things that look to be blatantly disinformation? How does it affect the medical community?
Well, it's really upsetting. It makes me upset and angry. And I know that you know, because you've seen me so angry when we're like, what are we doing this for? Like, we are all, I mean, everyone's making sacrifices. It's not just the doctors, like everybody's had their lives altered. But I mean, the extremes that we're going to keep patients safe, the extremes that we're going to in hospitals to kind of rearrange hospitals to put plexiglass everywhere, the PPE we're all wearing, the fact that we are seeing our patients just alone and not able to have their family with them when they're dying, regardless of what they're dying from. Like, we're seeing so much suffering. And then on the other hand, when we turn around and see people not following these basic regulations, it's so upsetting. Like, it makes us upset and angry, because then what's everybody sacrifice for? If this is happening and it's just going to spread it anyway and create more hospitalizations, we're not going to stop doing what we know is right. But it is really sad when we just see the loss that's out there and the sadness. And we know that it could be diminished. So we know, like, all the canceled people at canceled graduations and canceled weddings and canceled people not being able to have proper funerals. And then on the other hand, other people are kind of just doing whatever they want and doing whatever they feel like. It's really sad, because if we would sort of get it together as a society and maybe do things more along the lines of other countries that have been more successful, then it would be able to decrease people's suffering. And, and I did see another question here, like, I think it was a great question. What is the acceptable level of mortality? What is the acceptable level of illness for our lives to get back to normal? I don't know. That's such a challenging question. It depends on what you value and what is one life worth relative to other lives. It's a very difficult philosophical question as far as what's our acceptable deaths. How many parties can you have, and risking how many deaths makes it okay to have a party? Well, it's going to depend on what's the benefit here and what's the risk. So to be doing an activity that's risky, well, what's the activity and how beneficial really is it and how necessary is it? So to see people, yeah.
Well, I was just going to add, I think from the medical perspective, I don't think you can answer that question. I don't think you can answer that question from the legal perspective, or any of us could. I think at a certain level, that's a political policy question. But I would note this, for those who are wondering when is our life, when are our lives going to get back to normal? I don't think there's any real chance that our lives are going to get back to normal until there is a vaccine that is widely distributed and is proven safe and at least reasonably effective. And the reason is you still have a pandemic. I mean, we're still seeing, even at the lower days, 30,000 new cases a day. We all hope that number goes down, but we fear that number is going to go up for the next couple of months. And you can't, under any circumstances, go back to normal in that kind of with those kind of numbers. You can't. If we had 500 cases a day, maybe you could. And you're seeing that in Europe. I was on a call this morning with colleagues in Germany. Germany's pretty much back to normal. Why? Well, because they locked down for much longer than we did. They have a smaller country. Their culture, for better or worse, is used to following rules. And they had a much lower transmission rate. And so now they're able to open up. We're not in that situation. And so I think that it's going to take a vaccine and wide distribution before we're there. Hopefully that'll be sooner rather than later. But I think it's very unlikely that it's going to happen before that. There are others who would say herd immunity, right? And let everybody get the virus. Well, as you've heard, there are a lot of people who are going to die, a lot of people who are going to die unnecessarily if we do that, and many, many more who may have long-term health implications that could ruin their lives. And the reality is, it would take years before we actually got to herd immunity. So it's not really a solution. And I think virtually every medical professional who's at all credible, who's talked on this, has said, we can't get herd immunity simply by having everybody get COVID and ultimately then we have some immunity. A vaccine is really the only thing that's going to get us to a point where things can go back to normal. I don't know, Deborah, to add to that. Yeah.
Well, the only other thing I'd add is this kind of back to normal thing will probably be a different normal, and certainly a different normal for a while. And one of our, the pulmonary critical care attendings in my hospital, who had been in at Walter Reed, and he served in Afghanistan, and basically he said, after 9/11, it changed how we flew, and there were changes that are still in place even today. And he was saying, similarly with this new normal thing is going to be a different normal thing. It will be normal with masks on, or normal with some distancing, and normal with more plexiglass all around. Like, this is going to be a different normal for quite some time, even when we start to even approach what normal looks like.
And the travel industry's already acknowledged this, right? I mean, you've seen airlines in the last couple of weeks eliminating change fees permanently going forward. I think you're going to see that all across the travel industry. I think you're going to see people wearing masks on airplanes probably for the rest of our lives. I'm just telling you, I think that's likely. I think you're going to see hotels and restaurants operate somewhat differently. I think the biggest question in the economy, I mean, there are a lot of questions in the economy, don't get me wrong, but one of the biggest questions is restaurants, because there's study after study now coming out. Restaurants tend to be spreader places for the virus, and you know, outdoor seating is probably a lot better. Socially distanced indoor seating is certainly a lot better than not, but even with indoor seating and social distancing, people are transmitting the virus. And so how that affects the restaurant industry, we don't know. Again, with a vaccine, maybe that stuff is able to go back somewhat to normal. But what that normal is going to be, we're going to see. I did read an article that says that this pandemic is basically going to drive most, maybe not all, but most small restaurants out of business, because they just won't be able to survive it. Larger chain or restaurants that have backers with more money probably will survive it. But the small restaurant that doesn't have a lot of financial backing, it's just not looking good. And in virtually every community, we've seen restaurants closing permanently. Not all of them, but a lot of them. So it's going to be very difficult. I want to get to questions in a little bit, maybe in about 5 minutes. We've covered most of our topics. I do want to talk a little bit more about freedom of the press. And Nora, I know you talked about that a little. If you could just encapsulate in a minute or two some of the key points on challenges to free press that you're most worried about in this pandemic, and then we can all discuss that a little bit.
Sure. Well, the short answer is I'm the most concerned about access to information, and the link, the very tenuous link now with access to information, because reporters are not allowed to report on what is happening at the local, state, and federal level. And so, you know, within 1 minute, to just expand briefly on that, I think it's important for us to understand that press freedom as a term is not an abstract concept. That when we are given more information, when communities understand what our leaders are doing, and frankly, information about things like COVID-19, we are armed with more resources to make decisions and to be able to have our behaviors and our attitudes influenced by credible scientific information. So when we think about, you know, I've been working on defending press freedom for years now, and PEN America has been working since we were founded in the 1920s on trying to protect reporters who are targeted for their work. Typically, we have seen that around the world, and only recently started seeing more and more of these threats to a free press here in the US. So we've been doing a few things. One is we are always working in the legal arena to support and defend the First Amendment where journalists are concerned. One of the emerging areas I'm the most concerned about is how it's affecting journalists in places like Puerto Rico. Just to give you an example, the governor of Puerto Rico introduced and passed a constitutional amendment that would criminalize purveyors of false information about public emergencies. That bill, or that amendment, as it then became law, was used to target journalists that were trying to report on things around COVID, trying to get constituents, readers, the public, information about what was happening in Puerto Rico. And they were basically criminalized for doing so, which is a common trope we've seen elsewhere around the world, that disinformation is criminalized, but only used, these statutes are only used to target dissidents and journalists. And so it's kind of an emerging and I think troubling issue. And in terms of what we're then doing moving forward is we're trying to put pressure on state and federal leaders to investigate incidents which involve violations of press freedom. And so that work has been ongoing over the whole summer in the wake of the protests that we have seen, because we are working with organizations like the Committee to Protect Journalists, the Freedom of the Press Foundation, in tracking incidents where journalists are harassed, attacked physically or online, maybe arrested, hit with rubber bullets, tear gas. And that work is, we've seen now over 500 incidents. So it's really good work if you want to get involved actually at the advocacy level and be fighting for legislative solutions and other policy work to put pressure on leaders. And so I'm always open to hear from people who are in the audience who want to get involved.
Yeah. Well, one question that we had already got, Nora, was for you. I don't know if you saw it, that do assaults on journalists covering protests by protesters themselves require a different response than assaults by authorities or police? Do you want to just comment on that for a minute?
Sure. I mean, morally, I think any assault is a problem. So we need to just be clear, like from a base level, assaults on journalists trying to do their job from protesters or government officials, mainly law enforcement, those are problematic issues. But legally speaking, yes, there is a difference. And I don't, for time and frankly for interest for most people, I don't want to go down a legal lecture right now, but there are specific constitutional claims implicated when government officials target journalists and attack journalists. And so right now we are working on a couple of different lawsuits, both class actions, one in Portland and in Oregon on behalf of journalists that have been attacked by law enforcement. And we are also working with the ACLU of Minnesota on their class action, supporting their fight that the attacks on journalists in Minnesota have implicated their First Amendment rights. So the routes for relief are very different for journalists, depending on who is attacking them. And where government officials do so, I think one of the questions is, how are cops being trained? It's not really an arena that I work in anymore, but it's an arena that I used to do quite a bit of litigation around, which is called Section 1983 litigation. And that work it's a long haul, it's a very long road. And part of what we were always working on when I did that kind of litigation is long-term accountability, to create a kind of track record or what's called case precedent to protect people's First and other constitutional amendment rights. Frankly, there are a number of other issues that are implicated when journalists are attacked. The biggest issue we've seen are attacks photographers, so people who are trying to film. And then the now tertiary link that we've seen is when journalists are not being attacked, legal observers are being attacked in these protests. And so I just want to flag that because it kind of goes back to my concern around the narrative, and that when journalists or truth tellers or others trying to investigate and open up space to tell people what's happening, when they are not there, we don't really get an accurate picture of what's happening in any given arena. That's true for COVID, it's true for these protests. And I'm happy to talk more at some point later about the additional legal issues, but I want to keep it tight.
Yeah, I want to just follow up on one point you made, which is training, for example, of police officers. I think it's a huge, huge issue. My law firm has gotten involved in many, many cities now with people on commissions that the cities have put together on training police officers, number one, to better handle things like protests, and number two, to use lethal force much less frequently. I just want to share a story. The managing partner of my law firm always talks about his father. His father was a detective, a patrol officer, a police captain, and eventually the commissioner of the New York City Police Department. And he said in his 45 or 50 years on the job, his father drew his service weapon never drew his weapon once in New York City over 50 years. And he said, and that was because of training. That was because of diffusing difficult situations. Yeah. And the point he was making is that there's not enough training right now in how to avoid incidents where lethal force is used. And also how to avoid incidents where people are hurt by police officers, whether it's attacked or had rubber bullets shot at them, or tear gas, or even just being accosted or arrested for conduct that's not actually illegal. And so training really is, I think, absolutely critical. Doyle, maybe you could jump in a little bit and talk a little bit about how you see freedom of the press vis-a-vis some of these social media trends that we've been discussing.
Yeah, you know, I think one of the great challenges is that, again, well before we got into pandemic, traditional media was under a great deal of pressure because the way in which people obtain, consume, and decide to trust information has been changed dramatically by social media. And so, you know, as Nora mentioned, if you're going to counter disinformation, journalism is a source traditionally by which you can hold up the opinions of experts who have scientifically grounded or professionally grounded knowledge that is unique and relevant, and that they are regulated ethically by their profession in what it is that they put out. There's nothing like that on social media. And so, but on the other hand, if what it is putting out is more congenial to my view, then it's awfully tempting to say, well, I think I prefer this story. And especially, again, when we're confronted with something that is novel, like this coronavirus, you run into the logical fallacy of, you know, well, an expert was wrong, so therefore, why should I believe the expert? And there's a difference between, you know, experts can be wrong. That doesn't mean that my view on medical issues should be trusted over a medical doctor's. It should not. But at the same time, you know, a doctor may well be wrong. A pilot may be wrong. A lawyer may be wrong. That doesn't mean that doctors, pilots, and lawyers lack relevant and important knowledge. And so I think that's one of the biggest challenges is, as the role of trust in profitability of traditional media has declined under pressure from social media, how do you find a venue in which expertise is held up as something trusted? And that also goes to just the role of faith in institutions generally, I think.
Yeah, and I think one of those things that we're seeing is you really, it's a very stark contrast, I think, right now in our society, of people who actually listen to medical professionals. And that's not to say medical professionals are always right. It's not to say that Dr. Fauci or the head of the CDC or whoever is always right. But I think for the most part, those folks try to speak based on scientific fact. And how many people listen to that, or if they're hearing something from somebody else, a political leader or a journalist or someone that they follow and like, even when that flatly conflicts with what the medical professionals are saying, how often they listen to that person. And you know, this leads to the old basic psychological principle of cognitive dissonance, right? We listen to what we want to listen to. We hear what we want to hear. And if there are things that interfere with our belief system, we often reject them without carefully considering them. And I think if there's one message that at least I'd like to leave our audience with from this presentation is listen to people. Just try to listen. You may not agree with them, maybe they're wrong, but at least try to listen and think about what they say, because they may have things to say from all different backgrounds, from all different perspectives. I think we need to consider what people are saying and think about it carefully, and then we can have productive discussions. We're not always going to agree on points. A lot of the issues we've discussed today are extremely difficult issues. We've gotten a lot of questions, some of which we've answered and some I may get to in a minute, about, you know, death rates and what do we do and how does society act going forward. And they're very difficult questions, right? They're political choices that ultimately get made. Yes, we have outbreaks of various illnesses all the time. We haven't had an outbreak since 1918 that's been on the scale of COVID. We just haven't. I mean, yes, we have the flu every year, and yes, it kills some people, but we have vaccines against the flu. They're not always fully effective. They don't always go against every strain. We have vaccines against almost every other major outbreaking illness. We don't really have an Ebola vaccine, but Ebola is way harder to transmit than COVID. right? It's not an airborne disease. And so reacting to a true pandemic of the likes we haven't seen since the not terribly aptly named Spanish flu. Didn't come from Spain. The Spanish were the only people who acknowledged it for the first year. In 1918 through 1920, 21, we just haven't had a pandemic like this. And so the way we react in the United States, the way other countries have reacted across the world has been fundamentally different from anything we've seen since that time. And we're trying to use whatever lessons people learned back then to some extent now. But I think, as everyone has said, the information about COVID has evolved. And we know a lot more now than we knew in February or March. And people are trying to take logical actions, ideally based on that increased knowledge. But these are hard questions. There aren't obvious, easy answers. And it's not ultimately up to the lawyers or the social commentators or the doctors to make these decisions. It ultimately is up to the political system with strong input from the medical community. And that's, but again, there's no clear and easy answer to that. But what we've seen here is that COVID has, number one, made expression for all of us different and in some ways more difficult. Number two, we've seen legislative, government, other efforts to limit expression. We've seen attacks on the free press, and we've seen people who have a particular message that certain folks want to convey try to co-opt the sources of communication in society to promote those messages. So we've got a lot of issues to be aware of and talk about and think through as we go forward. I'm going to take a quick look to see if there are any other questions. I think we've really covered most of them as much as we're going to cover them on this. I know that there are some specific questions about details of death rates that I'm not sure any of us on this call are fully equipped to handle. You know, maybe Dr. Topol, you could just mention for a moment, you worked with Dr. Fauci many years ago. Maybe you could just share quickly your views as to how reliable you think Dr. Fauci. Deborah, you're on mute.
Yeah, Dr. Fauci is very reliable and very, very smart and very respected. I mean, he brought our country through HIV. He has been involved with every single pandemic. I see there are also some comments here about Sweden and about the flu. Sweden had an interesting approach, but their death per capita was much higher than Denmark and Finland and Norway, even with Sweden's approach. And so our population is a little bit kind of thicker than Sweden's population, so that wouldn't necessarily work with us. But yeah, I mean, COVID is not the flu. It's just so much more virulent for one person. The other huge difference between COVID and the flu is how many other people get infected from one person. It is so many more people that will get infected from one person with COVID, even when they're asymptomatic. That's a huge difference with the flu. With the flu, people become symptomatic very quickly, and they're infecting fewer other people, mostly because they are symptomatic pretty quickly. So that doesn't have them running around infecting everybody else. So COVID is not the flu. It's more virulent. It affects more people, much more long-term morbidity with COVID than the flu. And I would listen to Dr. Fauci. I think he knows what he's talking about.
Okay. Doyle or Nora, do you have any last quick comments before our time expires?
I'm happy to weigh in just briefly that, you know, I've been thinking as everyone's talking about how we have moved away from a sort of way of life and what will the new normal look like. And you know, I have to admit, my friends and family for some time thought that I was absolutely crazy when I started talking about the safeguards, the democratic safeguards being chipped away here in the United States, not just because of COVID, but over the last several years. And that, you know, in our work, we see the slow demise of democracies and the way that authoritarianism enters and then takes root in countries. And in thinking about how we are adjusting to a new normal in a number of ways, from wearing masks every day to not going to bars and restaurants to, you know, all of the kind of social and cultural things that are shifting, I think there are also ways that we have to gird against acclimating to a political new normal that has very serious legal implications that might threaten the way we think of this democracy here in the US. And so I just sort of think that there are oftentimes we need to take a gut check on things. And, you know, whether it's the Department of Homeland Security treating journalists as terrorists, which is a new thing they're doing now in monitoring journalists that investigate, you know, the pandemic and protests, to questions that we're not quite ready to answer, I think, around what are we abdicating? Are we abdicating too much or not enough in public health measures? Those are questions where we have to bestow a level of trust. And I think that the new normal is constantly being reset here, which means it's very hard to take stock of what we're doing and what we're seeing. But it's one thing that we all have to do. And part of that will come back to how we find credible information to be able to basically, you know, make the most of what we have. So I'll just close with that. Thanks so much.
If I could just chip in real briefly, you know, it's interesting because we've talked an awful lot about expression, but also about trust. And I guess the political science nerd in me is going back to one of my favorite books about America, which is Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America. And one of the things that he talked about as he was trying to grapple with this at the time, really unique idea that a nation founded on individuals and the rights of individuals could still cohere as a community, was something that he called habits of the heart. And these were things that held us together with some type of shared identity. And I think free expression is one of the ways in which we can build habits of the heart to the extent that we're able to, as you said, Larry, to listen to each other, to trust each other, to dismiss the idea that something is being done out of an ulterior motive or a malicious motive, and to try to find what it is that we have to do together in order to deal with the extraordinary challenge that we have right now.
Yeah, I think those are great thoughts to leave us with. I want to thank all of our panelists, Nora, Doyle, Deborah. I think this was very, very thought-provoking, and thank you so much. I want to thank all of the folks from FAV who put this together, and want to thank all of our participants and listeners. Thank you very much. Thank you for sending questions in. We really appreciate all of that, and hopefully this has been interesting, and I really appreciate all of that. Thank you all so much.